As I said, we're in section 2, applying what we've learned. So let's talk about Unit 5 and the World Trade Organization and how we talk about free trade. I'm going to ask you to do a discussion on this, so there's some additional resources in that discussion assignment. But let's talk a little bit about the World Trade Organization and free trade. So there are 10 benefits, this is on your test. There are 10 benefits of the WTO multilateral trading system. So I know that's a lot of words. Let's talk about what that means. We all know what the word benefit means, right? That's something good. We know what the World Trade Organization is. Multilateral means many-sided. So a WTO multilateral trading system talks about many-sided, which means many countries are participating in this trading system. So the first benefit is, very simply, the system keeps the peace. It makes everyone have a smooth flow of trade. It provides for a way for disputes to be arbitrated and decided, and it makes every country that participates have confidence that they can cooperate through the system because there are enforcement mechanisms. People are not going to do things that are bad behavior, basically, because they know that the WTO, if they make a complaint to the WTO, that the WTO will arbitrate that dispute and make people act appropriately. So the system does, number 2, allow any dispute between, and if you don't know what the word dispute means like an argument or a disagreement. So the system allows disagreements between countries. So if I say, I don't think that this should be treated as this country of origin in this way, the WTO will help arbitrate that dispute, make a decision, and make a ruling, and then everyone knows that we have to go by that decision. So it's basically like a court for all the countries that participate in the WTO. It's based on rules rather than power. So this is very important. This would be a very good one to list on your exam. But basically what it says is if you're a small country, if you're Uruguay in South America, you have just as much power in the WTO as the United States, or you have just as much power in a dispute if you're having it with Brazil. Non-discrimination, which is also on your test. The rules are universal, and the principle of non-discrimination, which means it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or large or small, everyone is treated fairly and equally by the WTO. So freer trade cuts the cost of living by making products cheaper. I gave you an assignment on WTO or international trade and how it helps jobs. And so you'll do that assignment about cars and computers, and you'll understand a little bit more about how it makes products cheaper. You're going to have a short essay to write on this on the exam. There's also an assignment that you're going to need to complete after that. So it gives consumers more choice and a broader range of qualities to choose from. So think about if you live in the United States and you're addicted to coffee. I think we've talked about this before. Coffee doesn't grow very well in the United States. If we didn't trade with other countries that can grow coffee, we would not have the choice between coffee or tea. We probably wouldn't have the choice of tea either, or much tea, because most of the tea comes from Asia. Trade lowers barriers to trade and increases national and personal income. So that we'll talk about that in a minute. Trade stimulates economic growth, very good for employment. Technology advances are also helping countries employ more people, and it may boost income for some people, but it certainly can translate into lost jobs. So if we say that we're going to trade more with, let's say, Japan and buy more Japanese cars, it could mean that people in the United States who manufacture cars have fewer jobs. So we have to look at, it may boost the income for some people, but it may cause job loss as well. It makes the system more efficient. It allows for a division of labor, because what it says is let Japan, who has the automation and the lower cost of labor, make those cars, and let's use United States resources and jobs to make something else that we're better at, that we can sell back to Japan. It shields the government from narrow interest, and it encourages good government and good discipline. It makes people have discipline about how their economic policies are developed and about how the government lays out the laws, the tariffs, the duties, all those things for other countries, because they know that they have to be compliant with what the WTO expects from every other country. So one country can't just have especially bad behavior, or they won't have any trading partners. So here's some critiques of free trade. I'm going to ask you to do this discussion. So people who are against free trade say that free trade is okay, it's a self-motivator, but that people are going to break the rules. That there are adjustment problems. Every citizen of every nation isn't going to be better off. So like what I just said, if you're a United States auto worker, you may lose your job or you may make less money because we're buying more cars from other countries. The pain to the people who lose like in this case, the United States or the auto worker is usually very much evident at the beginning of a free trade agreement or a free trade arrangement with another country. We're going to start buying more cars from Japan. Immediately, we're going to feel the pain in the auto industry. And it may be a longer period of time before we get the gains from the trade where we say now those auto workers are doing more strategic work for their company or they found a job in a higher paying industry. Necessary protection is a strategic trade theory. And what it basically says is that there's always going to be imperfect competition. And if you look at protective measures such as tariffs and subsidies. So I think we read a little bit about Airbus. We read a little bit about the car industry and the computer industry in our case. And then the hegemonic stability theory, which says the political prerequisite, so something that has to be in place politically before that, is that we have to have a hegemonic power, and free trade is more likely within than across political and military alliances. So if we have agreements with NATO countries, national countries that we do business with, like people in Europe, the UK, we are more likely to trade with them than we are with somebody like, for example, Iran, because we do not have a political alliance with them. There are developmental issues. We talked about social dumping, and I think if you've taken my global supply chain course, social dumping says, a classic example of dumping says that the United States said we cannot sell this formula, baby formula, in the United States any longer. And so they sold it in other countries for much less money, but it was because it was not acceptable to be sold in the United States. So let's say that right now, very perfect example would be, let's say that a COVID vaccine failed FDA approval in the United States, but that company took it to another country that had less stringent requirements and sold it to them for less money. That's called dumping, and it's not approved at all by the WTO. So there are a lot of arguments here we can run through. I've given you many, and you have plenty for your test, but you can read through these. So we talked a little bit about trade in the environment when we did the sea turtle case, and we talked about the fact that the WTO has no specific authority or agreement dealing with the environment, but a lot of people have come to the WTO to arbitrate environmental problems or questions or disputes because they feel like there's no other place to go. At the end of the day, the bottom bullet is the most important thing here. The WTO is only competent to deal with trade, and they are not an environmental agency. So current issues in the trade and environment is that there is no proper necessary forum for dispute resolution. We need to talk about eco-labeling. We need to talk about whether or not we're making too much paperwork, whether or not we have goods that are prohibited in certain countries and how they should be labeled, whether or not we should be making some requirements amongst the free countries that are really participating in free trade across the world about sustainable development. So are they developing recyclable packaging? Are they reforesting if they're harvesting lumber? Things like that. And then you did that activity on illicit trade to talk to you about intellectual property rights and how they should affect the environment, and whether or not there are issues around intellectual property and services about the environment and if they need to be regulated more. There's a lot about trade. So these three bullets in the center that have the bold, these are on your test. There's three things that have come up around labor. So the legal question is, should trade action be permitted as a means of putting pressure on countries if we feel like they are violating core labor rights? So what this means is, should I be able to say, if I'm the United States, I don't like the way that you have children working in your factory, so I'm going to stop doing business with you. I'm not going to trade with you any longer until you trade that. Should we be able to say, I don't like the fact that you make people work a 16-hour day in 100-degree warehouse with no air conditioning and only one break, so I'm not going to do business with you? That's the legal question. The analytical question, and you're going to need to fill in the words legal, analytical, and institutional. You're going to need to know which is which. The analytical question is, if I say my workday in the United States is 8 hours, and if I have you work 8 hours, you get a break for lunch and a 15-minute break in the morning and a 15-minute break in the afternoon. If I have another country that says my workday is 12 hours and you get a 15-minute break, a short lunch break, and that's it. Do they have an unfair advantage because they're able to work their workers more without the constraints that someone like the United States puts on their labor force? Is that unfair? And then the institutional question would be, is the WTO the proper forum to discuss these issues? Is labor part of the overarching influence that the WTO should have exercise over? And then there's the political angle. So we say developed nations. So the United States is considered a developed nation. We say core labor standards make the workplaces across the world improve, and that we should not allow countries that are less developed. So think about countries in like Africa or some of the smaller European nations, that we can't let them say that they're going to work their people because they have to in order to have advantage. This is on your test as well. This is very important. So the agreement on trade-related investment measures, you need to know those exact words. Trade-related investment measures. It's referred to as TRIMS. You also need to understand that it applies only to goods, not services. So only actual items. And it's saying that no person who belongs to the WTO can apply anything that is against national treatment, which we talked about at the very beginning of the term, or Article 11, which is about quantitative restrictions, so basically quotas. So you need to know the agreement on trade-related investment measures, TRIMS. You need to know that term. You need to know that it only affects trade in goods. There are no services involved here, only goods. And you need to understand what national treatment is. We'll go through that. You also need to know about, did I put any of this on your test? I did not. Let's just go through this. All right, you also need to know about TRIPS. You need to know these exact words. Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. You need to know all those words. And I want to tell you, if you try to remember this by using the word TRIPS, all the letters aren't there. You're going to miss a word. Trade-related aspects, the A isn't there. Intellectual property is there, but the word rights is not there, and the S doesn't stand for anything, so you need to know this. Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. This is very important. The TRIPS is a regulation that is designed to say it should be illegal to sit in a movie theater with your video camera on the day a movie opens, video the movie, and sell it on the internet. Intellectual property has to be protected. You should not be able to sell something that says Kate Spade instead of Kate Spade if it looks exactly like a Kate Spade bag. You should not be able to make a knockoff of music. You shouldn't be able to record that and sell it if it's not your music. So on your exam, the second bullet, this is going to be a bunch of things that you need to fill in the blank, in addition to the fact that you need to be able to tell me trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. You need to know you need to know the fill in the blanks to fill these in. How basic principles will be the word you're looking for of the trading system and other intellectual property agreements should be applied. In that first bullet, you're going to need to know principles and intellectual property. 2, how to give adequate, and the word you're going to need is protection, and you're going to need to intellectual property rights. In bullet 3, you're going to need how countries should, and the word you're going to need is enforce those rights adequately. Number 4, you're going to need the word disputes, how to settle disputes. And number 5, you're going to need the word transitional, special transitional arrangements. What this means is, if I'm a country that's not complying today with TRIPS, I should be able to put some kind of agreement in that says in the next 2 to 5 years, I'm going to make all the laws that I need to make. I'm going to establish the procedures to inspect, and I'm going to make enforcement so that my country will become compliant. So that's what transitional arrangements. It's basically saying I'm not compliant today, but I want to be compliant by a certain date in the future, and I will make a transitional arrangement for how I'm going to do that while the new system is being put into place. All right, that's the end of Unit 5. It's also the last lecture of of this term. So you should be ready to take your test if you've completed your assignments, and make sure you work also on your final project that is going to be due this next week.